joining the CPC roundtables for about the past 6 months. It's been definitely a learning experience, really enjoyable conversations, and I feel honored to be able to help moderate one of the sessions. I know Nathan will be popping in and out a little bit to help moderate as well. So the current state of things, right? Ryvit and Newforma worked together to build this point-to-point solution, and it solves a lot of challenges, right? But there's so much more opportunity to create project-centric workflows, including the RFI. And so the discussion today is going to center around, what currently exists out there in the Newforma to Procore connector, but what could the future state look like, and start to identify what are the potential benefits and what are the challenges around that, right? And to start identifying potential solutions to address some of those kinds of challenges. So I'll help moderate the conversation, but you can see here that Chris Collins from Ryvit and Aaron Kivett from Newforma are joining us today. They'll talk about the current state of what is, right? And then we'll get into what the future could look like, right? And we have Benjamin Crosby from Yates Construction, Caitlin Scanlon from DADO, Nick from Avicado, and Jeffrey. And we're just really excited to get all of these perspectives. So why don't we do a quick round of introductions? Everyone take about 30 seconds to introduce yourselves, and then we'll hop into the how might we conversation. So Chris, why don't you kick us off?
Sure. Hello, I'm Chris Collins. I'm also a senior product manager here at Ryvit, and worked closely with Newforma over the last almost 3 years on the CDX integration that we're sharing with you today. And as Greg teed it up, it solves a lot of problems, but the conversation is not done. So that's what we're here to continue.
Aaron, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Aaron Kivett. I'm the director of partnerships for Newforma. My goal here is to, our goal really is to connect Newforma and design teams to as many construction partners as possible. So working with Ryvit has really helped us to deliver on that goal. So looking forward to the discussion today.
Benjamin.
Thank you. Benjamin Crosby. I am with Yates Construction. Been with them for 15 years now, and been involved since I first started construction 20 years ago in the RFI and communication process and how different companies all have to talk to each other. So happy to be able to participate today. Thank you.
Caitlin.
Hey everybody, I am the newbie here, I guess, today. My name is Caitlin Scanlon, and I'm the Chief Product Officer at DADO. I've been really involved in Forms since we've been, maybe for about the last year, developing a Forms feature and really talking with the subcontractor industry around their perspective on Forms. So that's what I hope to share a bit about today and how we can improve that.
Well, thanks for joining. Nick.
Hey everyone, Nick Caravella. I'm with Avicado Construction Technology Solutions, and I'm an architect gone techie. I've been in the architecture industry for about 10 or so years, dealing with the real world issues of RFI and managing communications between building teams and owner teams. And due to that, became really interested in information and how do we handle it and exchange it. And so now moved into the tech sector for the past 4 years, and excited to talk about the future.
Yeah, man, excited to have you. Be good to hear your perspective. And Jeffrey.
Hi, Jeffrey Ouellette. I am an independent consultant working mainly with companies to figure out how to best execute in model-based workflows and business practices, especially trying to do that implementing open standards and best practices, industry best practices. I do a lot of work with Building Smart International and am the technical committee chair of Building Smart USA. So a lot of my perspective is how do we take a lot of what we've done in the building industry, transform it into model-based workflows, and then what are the ways that we can use, or if needed be, create standards so that those can be used more across industry tools and processes.
Awesome, man. Well, I am going to lead the conversation, but all of you are the real experts, and so I'll toss the ball to each of you along the way. But if you have something to say during the discussion, or if anyone in the crowd has something to say, please pipe up, and let's keep this an open discussion that really starts to dig down into solutioning around some of these kinds of problems, right? So to hop back to the how might we kickoff statement, right? How might we eliminate the contractual requirements for digital redundancy of RFI correspondence in ways that address the problem of taking ownership of the RFI away from all stakeholders and giving it to the project, so that each stakeholder can submit and extract exactly the information that they need at the time that they need it? Right. And so the way that I read this is that how do we eliminate the need for every stakeholder in a construction project to enter an RFI in their system and then go update that RFI in someone else's system, and there is just one RFI, right? And how do we get to that, right? And then how is that so that it benefits us, right? And we can extract information that is really helpful to the project and the individual stakeholders at the same time. So we're going to dig down into that today. So let's kick it off by getting into the state of what is, right? So I guess, Chris, why don't you walk through the state of what is a little bit, and then Aaron, you can come in behind Chris and then add some color as to why some of those decisions were made and what the current limitations of the connector as it is today. So Chris, why don't you dive in a little bit here?
Very good, thank you. So what you see here, and he's zoomed in very close so we can all see what we're looking at, but there's always two parts, right? Between the GC and the architect, there's the GC request of the architect and then the architect's response. So the CDX scenario map we're looking at now is about the request from the GC. And then in a minute, we'll go over the response as well. Obviously, this is part of a much bigger process, but this is the process that we've brought forward today. So starting over on the left here, just kind of a quick how do we read this thing, right? So we have the stakeholders involved on this scenario map: architect, general contractor, the personas within those stakeholders, your project manager, your project engineer, and then the systems of record. What kind of systems are touching the RFI record as it progresses, between the stakeholders, and then documents of record, how the actual fields map. There's a ton of detail buried in here, right? But what this does document is the actual integration that we have in place between Procore and Newforma Project Center to make that request automatic. So, the problem this is solving, the big pain point this is solving, is architects having to log into two platforms, right? Have to manage the RFI both in the Newforma Project Center and in the Procore software. Very good. You want to go to the workflow there, Greg?
Yep.
So I don't think anyone on the call is going to see this workflow and go, oh, now I know how that works. So obviously it's a pretty simple concept we all kind of know, but when you dig down to the details, there's a lot of hidden pains there, even with what we've done already. So obviously the general contractor has already been executing the RFI to this point. Maybe they brought it out directly, maybe it came from a sub, but they've determined it needs to go to the architect for the final answer. Whenever they make that switch, whenever they assign it to the architect, whenever they change responsibility of who owns it, I don't know if we want to use that word over and over, but that's where it needs to get sent, to use that vernacular, to the Newforma Project Center, right? Remember, the goal of this is to keep the architect in one platform, in their platform. So what Ryvit does in the middle is we continually monitor Procore for that transition state change. Whenever that RFI becomes assigned to the architect, we put it in the architect system. And then the architect begins their execution of what they have to do to answer that RFI.
Chris, only because you brought that up, I wanted to sidebar real quick on ownership and Paul Doherty, speaking to our architects here. So please, anyone who comes from that world, that the term standard of care might be like a good, or may or may not be a good term for, like how ownership is passing, is like, what is the point where I'm passing it off from one to another? Because it is ownership such a vague term that maybe we do use something like standard of care. But if those that come from that world, if I'm completely off base, please interject. But yeah, continue.
Standard of care is defined in contracts and in the insurance, liability insurance and things for architects. So it's not really vague, but I think I do agree that the idea of ownership and data ownership is a rat's nest that needs to be essentially completely nuclear bombed and started over with. And Nathan knows this, it's kind of been one of my pet peeves for a long time about how IP has been distorted to the point of being all data is unusable in our industry, because everybody is hollering about IP rights and trying to protect their information and all this stuff. And so it prevents the data transformation of an industry that keeps saying it wants to transform into a data-based industry.
But again, that problem's not going to go away. And so I think what we're trying to do is hit that head on.
So instead of
accept it as reality.
So instead of making it go away, is rethink about, well, what kind of data really needs to be owned, and what is it when it's shared, it's just owned by everybody. And then it's, it doesn't necessarily has to be open the entire world. It just needs to be open to everybody in the project. And it is what it is. It's information, right? It doesn't have a strict ownership.
There's a great clarification from Travis.
I was just going to say, Travis
in
is
the
on
comment.
it.
That the difference between ownership, like liability ownership, is ball in court, and data ownership, like how much am I going to retain of this after the fact, which is kind of like our dark data conversation in the other room, right? Yeah. But it's important to understand, the difference. Great point.
Yeah, great point.
And with this flow here, when I use that word ownership, I was more talking toward the transfer of responsibility.
Yeah, liability.
Right. Less about the data ownership and all the rat's nest of details that come with that. But there is a clear transition of responsibility for this shared document. This from the project point of view, it's one RFI, right? No matter how many systems think they own it or have it or record it.
Well, and I know Benjamin's here. So to your question there, Benjamin, I think that ball in court should be equal to that ownership, that liability ownership, that we really need to moralize and make that an important thing. But again, throwing it out there as a potential solution.
I was trying to distinguish between them, because if we look at all three from a sample, a trade contractor asks for the information. Ball in court, it's for the general contractor to see if they can answer it before they pass it on to an architect. And that ball in court, the architect will take that answer and they'll pass it on to 5 different consultants. Maybe if it's a really complex curtain wall thing, you've got a bunch of consultants involved in this RFI, and then it comes back. But the architect is the one that is liable 10 years down the road. Even that ball in court rolls around, if that curtain wall leaks, there is ownership and liability from the architect. Was their details right? And that's also why, and then that's the final also ownership of who has access to these RFIs to defend that leak. Was it the subcontractor that's going to have to actually do the work no matter what? But whether or not they get paid by the contractor to fix it, they foot the bill themselves, or the owner has to pay to fix it if it was the architect's mistake. So those are your 3 ownerships. And that's why we're all here, is because this solves like all of them, right? If if this information can basically be the same information that can reside with each of these people, and that handoff is smooth, it resolves all of the ownership problems. And this is the same issue that BIM went through 7 years ago, 8 years ago, and is getting fairly resolved now, where the model is the model and it's federated. And that's what we're looking really for, in my mind, is a federated RFI process.
Yeah, but it comes back to the point, and I know I'm getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, so I'll let Greg take back over. But where the documents of record are, like, that's kind of that question on that left side is that order of how they go and the barriers of where they cross and who's responsible. Like, are we changing that? Because that's a big contract deal to change those things. Or are we maintaining those intact and then doing everything else we can kind of around that to change process without really changing like the contract requirements? So that's, again, is a bigger question of like, from current to future state. Are you looking to change contract and liability, or are you looking to find more efficient process that doesn't actually rock the boat as much as some of these other options?
Okay. Well, let's go back through and follow that through and make sure. I think I have thoughts there, but like you said,
I know, yeah,
yeah.
we shouldn't, yeah, we shouldn't take over this call. Yeah, let's take a step back for those that are not.
I want to continue to dissect this current state as is, and just look at it and identify, you know, why were the decisions made that were made? What are the limitations or pain points in the current reality, right? And then let's go hammer on, or let's tee up what that future vision looks like, and then pick that apart, right? Like, what are the benefits of that? What sucks about that, right? And then we can get together and hopefully categorize and catalog some of these ideas, right? And see if a system can be solutioned around that. So Aaron, why don't you take some time to just dig into this? Nathan's nicely annotated this flow here with some points that maybe some challenging areas within the current integration, and maybe you can speak to some of those as you talk through the thought process on how this was constructed.
Yeah, and I can kind of address some of the comments about ownership through this workflow. But you know, the idea behind the CDX connector for RFIs here is that really, you know, on the construction side, you know, Procore, for example, has done a pretty good job of maintaining, well, both types of ownership around the ball and court and the documents themselves for the design side. Sorry, for the construction side. You know, the issue is that when the ball and court, or the ownership of who needs to take care of it, shifts to the design side, you know, this problem of who has access to the data, who has long-term, you know, ownership and responsibility for it. That problem isn't really easily solved by the architect just using you know, Procore to do everything, because at any time, you know, the contractor can decide to take away their access to the Procore project. So, you know, what most people do before this type of connector is they'd have to essentially re-enter that into, you know, a spreadsheet or something on the design side, or some other tool that they're using like Newforma to manage it, which is a waste of really everyone's time and money. So the connector is looking for that ball and court to shift from Procore over to the designer, at which point, you know, a copy of everything is taken out of Procore and brought into Newforma for the design team to manage, you know, getting that answer together. And then when they have, you know, arrived at the answer to that RFI, the connector again is looking for that state to change within Newforma to go back to the contractor, at which point it'll copy that answer out of Newforma back into Procore. So the idea here is that who's responsible for the data is maintained in both systems. It's very clear in both systems who's responsible for what. And at the same time, each side, each party, you know, has their own copy of all of the information that is important or relevant to them. So, you know, that's how we're sort of practically solving this problem today of both types of ownership. Does that help,
Very-
Greg? Did that make any sense?
That does. So I mean that touches on, right, the idea of ball and court. When is that transition from one stakeholder to another, right? And then the data is owned by the data in Newforma is owned by the architect, right? And the data in Procore is owned by the GC, right? And so there is a clear delineation of like what exactly is owned by which group, right? But like I guess the question is, should it be like that, right? Like, should it be that these different pieces of data are owned by these different groups, or should it be that like this data is owned by the project and these different stakeholders are contributing to that project data, right? And these stakeholders have the ability to access different pieces of that project data, right? And so that's like flipping it on its head. But
You're exactly right.
Yep.
You're exactly right.
yeah,
Yep.
but
That's
yeah,
the way
right.
it should
Good
be.
point.
That's the way it should be.
There's a conversation going in the chat that Dan Conroy started that I think is very pertinent to this. Is everything we're saying about project specific data and access to that data and accessing it and putting it through its changes does not remove the fact that different point solutions in accessing that shared project data will generate their own metadata around it, right? They will provide their own user experiences. They may even have their own copy of it, but it doesn't change the fact that the project now has a copy of it, right? And I think that's an important distinction to make, that you don't have to give up one to get the other.
Right.
They work harmoniously together.
But I do think there's there's a reality here though that is really important. Like there are a lot of things that are important to one stakeholder that are not relevant or even recognized by another stakeholder.
Absolutely.
You know, as you can't have one priority field, because again, I think as Dan put in the chat window, something might be very high priority to the contractor that is not even on the architect's radar. So this idea of there being one object that exists somewhere that everyone is sort of working with on the same level makes sort of this intellectual sense, but practically, I don't know is really on the same level as a BIM model.
So
I would agree with that, Aaron. Let me add one thing to Benjamin real quick. So I think you might be making the same point. I'm not sure. One thing that we have to remember is perspective, right? So when it comes to priority or statuses or things that mean something to one party and not another, you know, one person's waiting for responses, another person's in progress, right? Same thing with priority. You know, a GC is going to have their priority. They know which one they would like to have answered first. Communicating that as part of the request makes sense. The architect still needs to answer it within the confines of the contract. But that would be welcomed information to know that, hey, I sent two in the same minute, but this one is more important to me. If you can and are willing, please work on that first. So some things will be concrete facts that are moved through, and some things will be metadata about the transition state, right? And it's definitely going to have to be pulled apart. But Aaron, you're exactly right. It can't just be one priority field that everybody acknowledges and tries to stick to.
Benjamin, what were you going to say?
I mean, you can't argue about priority. It is more of a feeling than a reality. And if you have 15 priority fields or one priority field, even if they're fighting over what the priority is and they're moving it around, I think I would prefer that to having 15 where everyone puts their own priority to things. But the digital data does a lot to expose these human issues. But a big part of this is getting to those human issues to where, okay, so if we're having a fight about priority or a conversation or a cup of coffee over priority, that conversation needs to take place, and we should be able to somehow facilitate that in any way. But I don't think the technology is going to solve the different priority issues. And that goes for many other fields. Particularly, I have a project right now where we have just had a whole series of conversation about answered.
Yeah, I agree. I think that was an example of I think a very human issue of like like the architect is afraid that the contractor will mark them all high priority, and then then it becomes meaningless. So this issue of how we work together to make sure that urgent issues get addressed is not necessarily a software problem.
Mm. Yeah, there should be, I would argue that there's rules to how the project collaboration occurs, and those are set at the beginning. And so then everybody on the team understands like what is the requirements to make something a high priority RFI, and does it meet those? The problem is right now, those requirements are defined at points, and those people never talk to anybody else. And they have to be shared priorities and shared requirements.
We struggle to get our customers and contractors to agree on numbering schemes, let alone how to set priority. But yeah, these are definitely issues.
Yeah, and to just even tackle kind of this ownership of who owns the information, I think to take a step back and to even dig into the metadata aspect is who authors the information is probably a more prudent question, because those are the people who are responsible for that information that's been authored. And so that more so is who owns the information is the author. They own the liability for what they've authored, where then all the project information that every team has, and then going to the, like, what are the side or the reason codes, like each team can decide which information they're sharing to the shared pool, and then the liability falls to the authors of the metadata.
I think that's a great point.
So let's see, that has to follow through. There's the owner is the one paying all the bills. And so generally they have a say in what information they would like.
Yep.
Some of them are very particular. Some of them could care less. They just want a building that works when it's done. And then you have to account for the statute of limitations in individual states, countries, wherever you are, what information you have to keep and how long you have to keep it. So I want to make sure when we talk about ownership, right, there's the different ones. I believe you were talking about ownership regarding like standard of care, architect, statute of limitations. But also as a general contractor, I have to maintain my own records for statute of limitations. And I believe that's the beauty of this, is it's the same information. It could be in two different softwares, but the same exchanged content lives in both places, and it's the same because they talk to each other.
Yes.
Nick, did I sum up correctly what you were just saying?
Nail on the head. And like not all that information is shared. Like, so if you have that reason code as an architect and you don't want to share that for whatever reason, that can be something that you don't flag. That's your own metadata. That's not going to the project RFI, but that's your own internal RFI. And there's these basically lenses that are all looking at the same chunk of information that is then pulling it into your system, because a duplicate entry exists for the exact reason you lined out, which is we need to keep this information for the statute of limitations so we don't, we have the backup when we need it. But otherwise, this is like, it's an exercise in just spending a bunch of time pulling information, replicating it, and then doing the same thing for somebody else down the pipeline.
I believe another option in there is, even if an architect is fine with sharing their reason code, I don't want it.
And
so I could just
same thing with due date. Yeah.
Pick it out, right?
Yeah. Okay. The request to reply date that you send to them, they don't care about it. They want to know what you think it should be, but they're not going to accept it as gospel, right? And those are the things that we're not going to get around, and we just have to accept.
And that's the beauty of what Nick was saying around at the beginning of a project, right? Like all the stakeholders come together and they decide, well, what data do I want to see? I'm the architect. What data do I want to see from the GC? Or I'm the GC, and what data do I want to see from the architect? And some of those decisions can be made at the project level, and it doesn't have to be a one size fits all solution, right? There is some rules and some flexibilities as to how this type of CDX infrastructure can work, right?
But I'd be curious, because part of the productization of it is establishing some singular point that it goes through, right? Like that there is an industry level of, here are the ports you can go through, and then projects choose which path they want to go on, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's going to have to be some standardization, right? But there's also some customization that should be
Exactly.
allowed at the project level, right? Like this field in this system means this field in this system. Well, maybe one trade contractor does it a little bit differently than another trade contractor, or maybe one trade contractor's software system has a field that's called something different than another trade contractor's software system, right? And so building in that flexibility into the mapping and the data model will also be really critical.
But yeah,
Go ahead.
but I'm wondering if every AIA architect sends to AIA like the architect's version of an RFI metrics, and a GC sends it to the AGC, like their metrics. So it's like, what is that highest level from a reporting standard that we meet to, but that it's different than this governance standard that is always going to be at the project level and has to be decided by the project team. So sorry for sidebarring it, but that was interesting.
The fun part of this is we'll never have consensus. Otherwise, we'd all be wearing the same silver jumpsuits, just like the old sci-fi movies had, right? There's going to be this huge difference across things. And so I think, Nathan, what you're saying is we need the basic, some core things that we think everyone has to have, and then open up the doors for others on the side, right?
Exactly.
And those core things have to have a similar name. Or if they have the same name, then your CDX just
I was going to say, exactly. Yeah. Zoom into there. Because even right there, there's more than just, and that's actually the naming convention is matching what a Procore user would see in Procore, but there should be like a CDX equivalent field that it's mapping to. And that's that question is where those black nodes are. Like, is that the minimum that we need to set as a requirement? Is it less than that? Is it more than that? But it's obviously not all of those colored fields. Right now, the ones that are passing are the ones with the black nodes next to them. But like that's what February's for, right? Benjamin is like, we were having this discussion in 2017, very, very early on, not knowing what we were doing. But now we're kind of coming back to that same exact discussion, but in a much more mature framework and existing API integrations that lay some sort of a foundation of what can be done today, to then take that as a canvas and say, how should it be done tomorrow, given what we see here today?
And it feels like we're close, right?
Oh yeah.
I thought we were close in 17. Okay, so on the right is what you were saying, where the black nodes are. That is our current list.
This is the listed explanation of what the Newforma or what the Procore to Newforma integration for RFIs is doing today. I would like to have the exercise in February of saying, how should it be tomorrow? And Greg, if we didn't hit anything, we can, but this might be a good time to go to the future state, because I just kind of like made up my own and put a couple assumptions in there and some questions that we can talk to that hit on what you were describing at the very beginning, Benjamin, of like the order of operations of now in this future state, the trade contractor field foreman is taking on the load of that responsibility for the documentation, because frankly, they were doing it before anyway. We're just documenting it as such and actually accepting that as a GC. But of course, it's not going to go straight from the trade to that Ryvit CDX in the middle. It still has to go through the GC. But once it is accepted, that doesn't mean that they don't have direct connection into it to maybe potentially add, new updates or new attachments or whatever in some of those, might not work in the current state, but let's figure out what at least we want to propose as far as some key standards. And I think in the discussion, we'll determine what are the things where we have to actually make a decision in order for us to get industry benchmarks, and what are the ones where we recognize the market and the project will dictate which of those kind of three options they'll go with.
Yeah, so let me just take a moment to just describe this graphic here. And Nathan, you add color wherever you feel it's appropriate to add some color, right? We have that central CDX here, right? And we have all of our key stakeholders, right? We have our owner stakeholder right here, who is tied into the CDX. We have our architect stakeholder, who is tied into the CDX. We have our GC stakeholder, who's tied into the CDX, and we have our trade stakeholder, who is tied into the CDX. And then you've included some points for kind of approval and escalation here for the general contractor before the information comes to the CDX. So I'm going to actually ask you, why do we think that we need a approval from the GC before an RFI or a potential RFI hits the CDX? Why can't that approval run through the CDX? So there's that paper trail or that digital paper trail that even exists before the document was actually escalated to an RFI.
Oh.
That you had your own statement in there. It has to be something else before it becomes an official, before it goes to the architect as a RFI. So right now I'm using issues whenever I can.
Yep.
Right. We got to have a filter like Dan just commented there. Because we will get. I mean, just last week I had a steel company put 5 questions in one what they thought was an RFI, and I'm like, no, you can't do that. You should have learned this 20 years ago. It's 1 question per question. Mm-hmm. And so you have to have it. So you're saying we can throw it in the core in the middle, but it's routed to the GC to then sort it out and fix it before it becomes an RFI, right, Gregory?
Exactly. Right.
Good.
I'm not saying that there's no filter, right? What I'm saying is that the filter happens within the CDX, right? And that paper trail, like if a trade contractor submits 17 questions within one issue, right, the GC could come back and say, sort this all out, resubmit, I'm closing this one, create a new one, right? Like that could happen, right? But like why disregard that data from the CDX when you can include that data into the CDX, right?
And I think in the old world, in the analog world, recreating that would be a lot of work, but that doesn't necessarily have to be a lot of work if it is automated. So I think, again, like asking that question of, is it more digital work or is it more kind of like human work? Because we may have added more digital work to save human work, and it actually pans out from like an ROI standpoint. Nick, I can see you got a thought.
Yeah, there's like a layer to this, right? Because it's an access control thing. I think like if the information does go, like let's say it does go to the CDX, but it doesn't get access to by the OAC, like the OAE team, until the GC then says, yes, this is ready to rock and roll. That's totally okay, because with what chat just erupted with is the architect does not want to see questions that have not been vetted. I know it's set my hair.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, and really, like the vetting is almost like these lines. The green line, is kind of that acceptance, like, yes, this is a legit RFI, versus, hey, I'm not doing work until I get an answer, is your orange line. And it's like, yeah, there shouldn't be 3 lines, but where do you draw those 2 lines? That's an interesting discussion for us to have. Benjamin?
So what that just said to me, I want to see if I interpret this correctly, is that document hub that's in the center of your diagram, are you thinking that's its own information bank with its own database that sits somewhere?
I think
it
is its own representation.
Answer carefully.
But we have to pick one of those 2. Either we're creating a new information bank, or we're creating a blockchain where that sub puts it in their system and the exchange then kicks it out to all 35 others, or if it's its own bank, and that's a pick a horse and go with it.
Yeah, and I don't think that like someone said earlier, right? Like people have views. I think it might have been you, Nick, that said people have views of different parts of the data, right? And it's not that everything that the trade contractor throws into the CDX is viewable by or the architect is notified or is viewable by the architect. It's that all of that data lives there, right? And then everyone has their frame of reference into that data, right? And that could be decided at the project level ahead of time, like what, me as the architect, what data do I want to see? Do I want to see stuff when the trade contractor throws it into the CDX before it's been filtered by the GC? Well, the answer is probably no, so they select no, right? And these types of rules can be determined by the CDX. Caitlin, I'd love to hear your opinion about how this type of paradigm would work from a trade contractor perspective.
Well, I can definitely say there's a lot of parallels between the architect side and the sub side, the duplication of information, the need for filtering. I mean, it's almost like it feels one-to-one. And then you have this person in the middle who's like kind of passing the ball and playing the gatekeeper, right? Which is basically the GC. So, I mean, at the sub level, they don't want all that information either. They just need the response they need. And so they want to own their piece. The clarity of the information is their responsibility. The detail of the information, I think Greg had actually posted this earlier, that there's kind of like 4 steps in the GC or in the sub process: gathering the information, transferring it, logging and maintaining it, and then monitoring the response. And there's so much waste in that whole process. So I think as we go through and look at the subcontractor view, it's just where can we eliminate that waste so that it's a more seamless flow of information, regardless of who is the gatekeeper. Because there is just redundancy, I guess, on both sides. That would be interesting to reduce, and then everything will go smoother.
Yeah, exactly. So, right, we have this potential framework, right? And you know, we've kind of thrown out a lot of like challenges, a lot of oh well, this stakeholder is not going to like it done that way, or this stakeholder really wants it done that way. I'd also love to hear what we think like the owner's perspective is of all of this. Nick, do you think you could provide any perspective on what the owner would want, or if there are any owners in the room, what the perspective would be here, right? To have one central repository of all the RFI information. Like, is that a big win, or does the owner just want their individual slice of what the RFIs were?
I can't speak for all owners, and I've worked with a variety of different ones, and I think it really, there's owners who want to be involved in every aspect of a project, and there's owners who frankly just want to know when the doors are going to open. And so to go back to kind of what we were talking about is like allowing people to determine, you know, what they want to see out of the information, and have this kind of agnostic approach about this is where all the information goes. This is how we access all the information, and then you get to choose what you get to see, and you only get to choose from what other people said you have permission to see, to kind of resolve that gatekeeper question. Is then the way that we can kind of be need agnostic to the solution, because there's contractors who I work with who first cost contractors, like get it, build it, do it, whatever you have to do, and then we're done. And then there's other ones who really truly care about the program that they're managing. I'm not saying that the other folks don't, just different philosophies. And then there's also then the value conversation we should all be having is what happens when all this information is centralized, and what are the decisions we can make with projects to make better decisions for every project now, as well as the ones in the future.
So Nick, I feel like the challenge to the like every owner is different concept is like anyone in consumer product goods, right? Like Unilever, they make products for all the different categories of like those that are going to pay more, those are going to pay less, and like they figure out how to essentially meet those customers' needs, right? So like maybe it is more about like, yes, we recognize not every owner is going to care, but who are the ones that do care? Why do they care? And how do we really exploit that story? And then those that care less, tell a different story and figure out how to, you know, do it for cheaper.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that the easiest owner group that would just jump out at me are who are the ones that are building projects that are more product than building. What is the building typology? A Walmart, for example, likely, where they're doing the same thing over and over again. Site doesn't particularly matter as much as the economy of the build and how fast it goes. Those people who are looking for those metrics and want to systematize their project delivery process are going to love this. People who are doing like your mom and pop restaurant, they're not going to care. They barely knew what was involved in the first place. And so like understanding, you know, how can we get the data to scale and to improve the project delivery process, and who are those groups? Those are going to be the ones that really want this the most.
So my question is how many of you on the software side think that API one-to-one relationships are scalable in the long term?
What would be the alternative to that?
Well, you base things on open standard protocols that you can then build these connections through, right?
Which means
The
adding
problem-
something in the center. Yeah, like
Because
do you
the
need something in
problem,
the center?
the problem you're having is, Ryvit, what if you need to make connection to all of Procore's competitors? So how much work is that going to take to do that over and over and over and over and over again?
So
Right.
it's an interesting question, Jeffrey, but if you wrote them out, it's the same count. Like there's different efforts and different clarity levels in it, right? But connecting every system to every other system is not really a reality because subs don't connect to subs, right? GCs don't connect to GCs.
No, that's a dangerous road to go down.
Well, reframe your question. Maybe
when we look at any other industry, the ability to connect these different platforms and share information, there's very few restrictions in that being done, right? So you can't say that the method of doing business today is the most optimal way of doing business, and that the only connections necessary between two pieces of software depends entirely on the end users of that software or the domain end users of that software. Because I don't believe that's true. And I think this is one of the things that we're trying to pursue with a model-based workflow in which all of the model data is able to be federated across multiple systems, and the data accessed, any of the data accessed by anyone at any point in time that needs it for different purposes. So when you look down the road of things like digital twins and doing data lake management and analysis, in essence, what you want to do is you want to be able to create a situation that says at any point in time, I can dive into all of the data that's been created across a multitude of tools and stakeholders, and I can start picking out those and trying to analyze features of that data set that I think are important to the question I'm asking, right? Which is, well, what about the, what is the current static value of all the materials in my building as of today, right? Somewhere along the line, I've got to be able to aggregate what all of those that materials are in there, when they were delivered, what was the cost at the time, what would be the equivalent value today, and all of that kind of stuff.
And Jeffrey, but real quick, that's a reporting standard, right? Because back to that reporting versus governance. So that's a reporting, and
yeah,
and the question.
But again, if you don't establish the data connections in the first place, and you don't have an agreement as to how all of that data is constructed and accessed, then I have I can't do that.
That's the chicken and the egg, right? Is it connections before data, or is it data before connections? Because I think as of right now, I would argue data before connections, but again, every couple of years, I feel like I switch. So,
okay, so they build on each other, and so if you try to do one first and the other, we're never going to get anywhere. So we've got to take a step here, step here, step here. The APIs don't. A bunch of people have APIs right now, and they only get used by your biggest companies on your biggest projects because the resources to use them. And so APIs, I would say, Jeffrey, are not sufficient because right now they are not consistent enough with each other. If they will follow us, this group right here who said, call them these things, to where then it's not writing a big API, we're not having to interface with the API, we just say, oh, this goes here, this goes here, this goes here. That's what works, because I think what you were saying to Chris is 2 people is 1 connection, 3 people is 3 connections, 4 people is 6 connections. It's exponential, right? And so that's why it has to have that common naming. And then someone else comes to join, they just play, oh, RFI answer 1 is this, or comment is this, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. Jeffrey, did I sum up what you were saying as well, or did I go the wrong road?
No. And that's the general direction. And so this is one of the things that is being worked on from the Building Smart perspective, is an idea of establishing CDE standards, right? Or connection API standards, so that you can get all of these different data environments to able to at first connect to each other, and then after connect to each other, be able to see documents across each other's different data environments, and then begin to do things like request and pull and push data through across the different data environments. And then that's where, like I said, you begin to establish that the federation of data is all about in service of the project. It's not necessarily restricted to a particular domain or person or anything like that, right? And it can be more easily aggregated. And then you use communication protocols like a BCF for a model-based workflow that says, oh, during the design process, the contractor has a question about a particular thing to the structural engineer and the architect. Well, when that request is made, it becomes a part of the project data connected to the model. And then everybody can see that who wants to see it or should see it. And then when that issue is resolved, then that resolution is saved as a part of the project data connected to the model, connected to the very place. I think that the thing that interests me in what was said before is that I think a lot of these problems are 90% people and process and have nothing to do with technology, right? Is trying to figure out, like, are we making things overly complicated, and why are we making them overly complicated? And it's usually because of, domain ownership issues and, these types of things that have just built up over time. So if you worked it backward from saying, well, if we all work as clients of the project, how does that change these dynamics of where the data goes, who does it? Because in a sense, this idea of filtering is, so what? So that every subcontractor throws in their questions into the pool. I don't care, because if I'm the architect, I can just simply see, well, which ones am I supposed to pay attention to? Because my role may have been attached to that request or not. If my role is to, hey, who's going to answer this question? It's not on there. I don't care, but at least I know it's always there. And if I wanted to go back and say, hey, how many times did subcontractors have to do a request on the lighting layout for a particular building? Then I can go back and say, you know what, my MEP engineer really dropped the ball on this. And then I can go back and fix that part of the process, rather than waiting, or somebody never fixing that. And I go 3 or 4 jobs with the same MEP guy and he keeps screwing it up. Right? So these are these opportunities of saying, what if I establish these standards, and what if I establish these communication standards that says, okay, how can I aggregate this data in a way that becomes meaningful over the entire life cycle? Yep. And then the last point of that is, I'd also like to know is, where are RFIs most likely to pop up? And is there a way to say, well, we're talking about RFIs in a way that make them inevitable, but is there a way that RFIs go from thousands in a project to literally dozens or less than hundreds?
I think that's how we finish out this discussion, is like, because RFIs have been so demonized and everyone's just trying to get rid of them, when I'm like, hey, an RFI is a question, but I agree that there are such things as bad RFIs, that this whole, how do you categorize RFIs in a standardized way that help you understand and sift out the good ones from the bad ones? I see Benjamin's head's turning a little bit.
They're questions that somebody needed to ask. No one sits down and writes something just for the fun of it. Now, there's some that are a little ignorant and they ask a bad one, but they have to be asked. And whether they're RFIs or issues or data points or coffee topics, that part, I like it because they've been demonized as RFIs. And I had this, I wish that my owners meeting that I had last week on site, we could attend this, because they had all the same questions. They're like, well, how come there's all these open RFIs? Because the question has been answered. Well, but that reflects badly on the architect. I'm like, not necessarily. The architect thought they answered and we didn't have answers. They've got to undemonize that and get the information to the people that it can actually build, which is, I believe, our goal. Especially you start talking about BCF and all that stuff. It's all the same idea. How do we easily transfer the information so that people are not in the way of the answer and they can actually get their information out? And that means
You just muted.
Yeah, that means a simpler path. We have to take all of this very complex situation. And as you can tell from this conversation today, we keep running down all these different roads because the situation is exceptionally complex. And if we can start piece by piece adding a layer of this is a simple, easy, clear path, will be very successful.
I just want to get in a couple things on that. I think the idea of a standard for an RFI amuses me because it's very simple. Like it's a question and like a date. So it's not a complex technical issue. The thing that makes it complex is the fact that you have a question that somebody has to answer. And the idea of the GC checking the things before they go to the architect is because they might know the answer and the architect might have moved on to another project and has run out of money a long time ago for construction administration, and they don't have the time to sift through random questions. So there's a lot of just people, financial, practical realities involved in this process that we are not going to solve. So trying to keep the technology at a simple level of how do we make sure that we eliminate the parts that the technology can eliminate, things like double data entry or uploading and downloading files from one system to another. Like those are the things that are easy for technology to solve that, that we can practically do.
I think that also touches on that it doesn't have to be all or nothing, right? Maybe there's some very obvious things that we could try and make inroads where, like, if a subcontractor is asking for a dimension, that feels like the most basic thing where we could start, right? Or we could pick what is the most basic thing to start with and learn with the simple things and then keep moving forward. Because I think some of these things we could debate until we're blue in the face, but what really matters is starting to chip away and learning as we go. So I think that's where we're going to get the most progress instead of trying to solve the perfect system without actually doing it yet.
And I think, Caitlin, to your point, and Nichole, I know we've had a lot of these past discussions trying to work through this. And I know one of your big points was the drawing reference and needing to have, that full capabilities of the drawing reference, which again, of all these things hasn't seemed to rise up as high on the priority list. And kind of curious, knowing that conversation was probably over a year ago, like how important you feel like from the customers you're working with is having that drawing reference, and would you still make a hard argument for it, or it's sort of in the nice to have camp?
I don't know. I feel like Caitlin just kind of hit the nail on the head. I think we have to start somewhere, and maybe it is kind of simplifying it instead of overcomplicating. I just fear that from so many stakeholders being accountable throughout this process, and so many things that could potentially go wrong, or cost implications, schedule implications. All of these things are contractual language, and we have to actually, start prioritizing what is the priority, and maybe simplifying it is going to be the best way to go. But I do think that context is key. If I have a photo from the field and an attached drawing or a pin on a drawing, I want that stuff to elevate and move with those data fields that are being prioritized from one platform to the next. So I don't know, I guess start small.
I would 100% agree with that, because I feel like I have folks in the field who right now there's some limited mobile capabilities where we do want to see those sheets in the field or any additional photos. And oftentimes if it's not created on the desktop, maybe yes, you can see it, but if you do it on the phone, maybe you can. So there's so many like different scenarios in the field. Folks, they don't care if you can or cannot do it, or they don't remember what was the sort of workaround. So I definitely would advocate that the attachments, whether that's sheets or photos or videos, are a really important piece that needs to go with the RFI information.
I could challenge that though, with the idea that, like, in a design build environment where there is a much more collaborative.
Who's challenging?
Nick.
I'll be a resident pain in the ass. It's okay. But I think there's a couple things about RFIs that controlling the flow could potentially be a bad thing. On cost-sensitive projects where maybe there's 3 proposed solutions and we want to collaboratively work with a general contractor to find the right path that is economical, there's conversations to be had. And right now the conversation is incredibly rigid. And that's what takes so much time is I have to go and propose these solutions. Then we got to go get pricing. And there's many times where I'll just pick up a phone call, and that's what I've done in the past. And so how do we start to find ways for when we have this shared information to communicate, validate, and make the right decisions? The second thing I wanted to talk toward, though, was like, I think RFIs, bad or good, are all good and important. If you discourage people from asking questions, that's when you get problems. And so changing the tone about what an RFI is, and then what's nice is having the center of information, whatever it might be, is we can start to analyze, where are bad questions coming from? Where are good questions coming from? Why are those questions being asked? And help inform teams. Because just for context about my career, I graduated right at the cusp of the recession. I was a PM well before I should have ever been one. And I made a lot of dumb mistakes because I just didn't have somebody to mentor me. And having opportunity to access this information and set controls for how this communication happens only makes the entire project move smoother.
Yeah, I'm going to echo Rob's comment. Who is picking up the phone? Who is calling?
People still pick up their phone. I'll call you twice.
Someone left me a message. I'm like, why can't you just email me?
I
will never come back to your voice message. It will not get done.
I don't know how many of you remember, I mean, I got a gray beard, so I go back a little ways. And I remember before there was no technology to manage RFIs and not even a possibility. And I never, I'm a subcontractor, but I also have technology for subcontractors that's trying to resolve some of these issues. And so I never got RFIs unless it specifically dealt with me, because a GC would spend the time to own it and to determine who really was affected before I ever saw it. And then I knew specifically what I was addressing. And as soon as email came out, and that became the norm, they realized they didn't have to spend any time and energy to do that anymore. And we got the massive data dump. Instead of getting a couple RFIs on a project, I got hundreds and I'd have to sift through them. So the liability got passed down. Why could that? Because there was no clear definition of who owned what or responsibility. So it really wasn't the technology piece. It wasn't the flow. It was like unwritten things that were behind the scenes that had never been defined before. They were defined by economics, really, because who wanted to make 1,000 copies and then put them at everybody's box in the job shack? That's really what it came down to. And then as soon as they could dump, they dumped. And so now what we're faced with out there is we have hundreds of these things, and we have to sift through all of them to find the 2 or 3 that affect us. If we don't, we may be screwed. And so it becomes that dynamic that says, but RFIs are good from our standpoint because, heck, we don't control any of the process early on. So we have conflicting drawings. Not only do we have architectural and structural, but now we have submittal drawings that now take precedence over those that may create additional conflict. So how else without the RFIs do you manage that? So I think the technology has exposed a bigger problem over time, but it also can eventually be the solution. But it's going to be really hard until we define, ultimate liability as well as responsibility. So
I like this. A lot of the times we're trying to duplicate the same traditional RFI flow with technology. And I have yet to hear a software company say, we're going to change this and flip the switch and say, this is going to be the tech way to do an RFI. So I feel like, maybe I haven't heard that, but I feel like we're trying to stick with tradition and put a technology layer over it.
So I like this idea, right, of trying to simplify, right, like this idea of like revamping the RFI, as you say, Lil, or a simplified version of the CDX, like not try to boil the ocean in one go. I think we have just a couple more minutes here. I'd love to hear who we think is out of all the stakeholders in a construction project, who is the stakeholder that's going to be the advocate for this first true project-based RFI solution, right? Like, is it the owner? Is it the GC? Is it someone else? Like, who is going to stand up and say, like, yes, let's try this on my project. I'm going to advocate for this, and this is why.
Can you sign and seal a TikTok?
It's going to be the GC on some projects, the architectural engineering firm on some projects, on the trades on some projects. The one who had the vision. I don't see the owner ever doing it because the owner has the money and they dictate their stuff has to go to them. It's all three of those other parties who have to do double entry, triple entry to communicate with each other. Is that what you're asking, Gregory?
Yeah, like who feels the most pain, I guess, right? Like, I think, right, it's clear that the architect and the trades are feeling a lot of pain from duplicate entry. You can obviously speak better than I can, but for the GC, right, like the coordination of all of the information, double entry into the owner's system, like who is feeling the most pain and who's going to be the biggest advocate for revamping this broken process?
It mostly falls on the GC because they are in the middle. The owner requires something, and then the GC ends up using like the owner system and their own system, or the architect system and their system, and then the GC is the one that has to collect it from the subs disparate systems to put it into the other systems. And so the GC is going to feel the most pain on this. Does anyone else have a different perspective?
I think that that's not necessarily the case. You talk to clients that have owner, architect, engineer, GC in-house, and this process is as antiquated as any. So it doesn't really matter if it's, I don't think that, I think it's somebody that's going to be completely just out of the box, say this is how it is. And I think it has to be the owner to articulate that for things to really change, honestly, because the process isn't any better if they have everything in-house.
Yeah, Benjamin, I think that the GC is the hub, naturally it is, but they have a contractual relationship. So unless they're incentivized to be that way, they won't be that. And so it does really come from the owner. There's got to be an incentive for them. Same thing with BIM, for that matter. Why are not all projects using that technology? And it's an incentive-based thing.
Well, and yeah, just to hammer that home, I think the pain is felt by the vendors, but it's the cost of that pain is by the owner. And that's when you control your pipeline and you make your vendors work together really well, you save a ton of money. That's what every other industry is doing.
Mm-hmm. I think the pain, though, is generally on a day-to-day basis felt by the party that has the least power, because if you think about it, our customers, some of them will use the contractor's system and hate it, and some customers can get the contractor to use the architect's system. Mm-hmm. So, and some projects are different. Like sometimes you have an owner that will make everyone use their system. Like somebody has the power on that project to inflict the pain on somebody else.
Yeah. But the inflictor is not usually feeling any pain, so they're not going to change it.
They feel the least pain.
I definitely will vote the DC feels the pain, and I feel like if the owner does want us to use their product, and they own that data, and oftentimes they're not going to want to give up that data to the DC, right? So we're having to duplicate that information on our end. So, and everyone's back. Welcome back, everyone.
Oh man, we were supposed to get have a long discussion and then not realize that everybody's here, and then we come back. But I guess we're past that now. We're all experienced, right? Gregory, why don't you go ahead and tell us what you guys concluded with in the discussion?
It was such a beautiful 70 minutes. It really was. It started off early on around a conversation around ownership, and ownership kind of came in two flavors, right? It was kind of that ball and court ownership of an RFI, like who is in charge of responding to that RFI, and whose responsibility is it at that point? And then the ownership of the data, right? Like what are the legal requirements around retaining the data? Who's responsible for those legal requirements? So a lot of conversation early on about ownership. And then we kind of got to like, well, how are we going to skin this cat, right? So it was, are we going to go down this API-based architecture, or do we need to go down a model-based architecture? And there was a lot of conversation around that. And then I really like this thread at the end that we had is like, we are, in these conversations, when you get 40 people in a room, right, we're trying to boil this ocean, right? And everyone has an opinion about like how this is going to be really challenging, or how we should do it this one way, or we need to consider this one thing. And these are all super valid considerations, right? But the idea of starting small, proposing something, making something, putting it out there for people to use, play with, and start giving feedback on is, I think, this really important idea, right? And so the question is, like, how do we take that step, that first step into this project-centric RFI, and start getting people to use it, to start getting some miles on it, and then continuing to adjust and change and make it better as time goes on.
The proverbial chicken and the egg discussion.